people couldn't make it. And so we'll record this and make it available in the future. So Jonathan, it's all yours.
Great. Well, thank you, Anthony. I hope everybody can hear me. This is a little bit of a test of how this system works, and we will be having a number of sessions over the coming year on a variety of different topics as a way to support the work of the Education Bloggers Network and all of the people who are involved, or any and all of the people who are involved in fighting for public education around the country. The Education Bloggers Network, as a number of the people who are participating in tonight's or today's session know, is a confederation of about 230 plus bloggers and columnists around the country. And we have been working since about 2012, 2013 to share ideas and share resources as we fight to push back the corporate education reform industry and ensure that public education has a strong voice across the country. We think that this is probably the first and most important example of what happens when you bring bloggers together to share ideas. There are lots of ideas on the table about how to make it even stronger, and we'd like to do that. And many of us, of course, are focused on our own blogs, but as a group, we have talked about ways in which we could expand our reach and expand and help train and build people, build the support program to expand our audience and reach more people. So this is, I have to be honest, this is sort of a first run at this. We hope to have many more in the coming months. This one we wanted to start with, perhaps the most important of all, which is how to build an audience, how to build the techniques for and the tools for uncovering the truth. And we have a number of new ones and additional ones coming up. We will have one on how to expand our reach, which is going to be on Thursday, April 5th at 8 p.m. And you'll see the link there if you'd like to join. That one will focus in on helping people in order to build an audience and in order to build their reach. Simply go in and grab that link. We'll also have this available afterwards, and hopefully we'll send it out to all of the participants. And the number of people joining tonight is growing quickly, as well as people who signed up ended up couldn't join us tonight. In addition to our next session, which is on April 5th, we also want to make sure that any and all of you who can possibly make it to the NPE conference, which is coming up in April in Raleigh, North Carolina. And that's one that's going to be, this is the third annual conference. It is a spectacular opportunity to bring people together and talk about what's working, what's not working, the latest issues related to the education reform or movement, or those that are in the corporate education reform industry, and how they're undermining public education. And finally, we want to make sure that if you are a blogger or a columnist and would like to be part of the Education Bloggers Network, we would welcome you. On the screen in a moment will be ways to contact us or contact me. Again, it's Jonathan Pelto at johnpelto@gmail.com, and we would ask that you get a hold of us. We'd love to have you part of this consortium, this confederation, as we work to bring individually and collectively truth to the public education environment. So tonight we have two incredible presenters who have really expanded the technique of using freedom of information requests in order to determine what's going on inside the closed doors and how to use that information to change the public debate. So Leonie and Dora, who many of you already know, are two of the most effective education advocates in the country. interestingly, on both ends of the continent, from New York to Seattle and Portland and the American Northwest. And they have used a variety of techniques, both with their own blogging and their own work, but particularly tonight focusing in on how to use freedom of information requests, how to use research as a mechanism for identifying what is going on and how to alert students, parents, teachers, and public education advocates on the techniques that are being used by the corporate education industry, the charter industry. And so we could give each of these people an hour or two, and we still wouldn't have enough time to learn from all of the things that they have to say to us. We're going to do this hopefully in about an hour. Each one is going to take about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll leave it open for questions and answers. And so first will be Leonie from Hanson from New York, and then Dora Taylor, who is from the Pacific Northwest. And let me just, before I introduce Leonie and turn it over to her, thank Anthony again for providing all of the support and the technical expertise on being able to make this happen. Many of us already know Anthony, but if you don't, you absolutely need to read his work, his writing, his book. Anthony and Diane Ravitch and many of the others that have been leading the way. We consider ourselves to be disciples of their extraordinary work. And we can say that over the course of the last few years, we have made a fundamental difference in this debate and restructuring and changing the way in which the debate is taking place. I don't think that, we certainly don't have the hundreds of millions of dollars, but we have something that they will never have, and that is a fundamental belief in our mission and a fundamental belief in the importance of public education and the future of our society. So on the right-hand side, you should see in the chat box, for example, there is a link. If you can make it to Raleigh in order to register, we'd ask you to please consider coming to that important conference. As I said, this will be the first of a number of webinars over the course of the next year as a way to strengthen both those that are involved in blogging, but also those that are involved in the battle for public education. So I thank you for taking the time, and I'd like to turn it over to Leonie and then to Dora, and then we will have some time left over for questions, answers, and discussion. So Leonie, it's all yours.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for holding this. I'm going to go through these slides fairly quickly. I think they'll be available afterwards, but I promised Anthony I would do this in less than 18 minutes, so here goes. Next slide, please. Anthony? So the first one I want to talk about is the Chris Cerf investigation. He was a former chief operating officer of Edison Charter Schools and a consultant to the New York City Department of Education. He was hired in 2006 as deputy chancellor. A couple months later, he was asked by a parent leader at a public meeting whether he still owned Edison stocks because Edison did business with DOE. Cerf vociferously denied this without revealing that he had sold his stocks that morning after finding out he was going to be asked that question, which was revealed by the New York Times. After that, I and others asked our special investigator, Richard Condon, to look at the legality of the fact that Cerf had continued to hold on to these stocks, not only after he was hired officially as deputy chancellor, but before that when he was a consultant to DOE as well. Next slide. Next slide, Anthony. So it turned out that Condon's report was finished in August 2007, but I sort of forgot about it and then ended up foiling it when it wasn't publicly released until December 2008. We found out that the Conflicts of Interest Board had, in fact, criticized Cerf for not selling his stock, but also for having asked Edison for a hefty contribution for one of his favorite charities in exchange of divesting his stock for basically nothing. And though they didn't fine him, they did say that the kind of thing he'd done he could have been fined up for $10,000 with other penalties. The special investigator also reported that he had relinquished an ongoing consulting contract with another company connected with Edison just that morning, a consulting contract that was worth potentially another $2.5 million. And these findings drew headlines in New York papers, but also was brought up when several years later he was appointed as the Commissioner of Education for New Jersey, and now actually he's the superintendent of Newark Public Schools. And here are some of the headlines that FOIL released generated when I gave it to the reporters. Next slide, please. So, oh yeah, and this shows you another headline, and that the report was actually heavily redacted. So there were whole pages that were scratched out that we never got to see. I appealed the redaction. I got nowhere to do any more. I would have had to go to court and get a lawyer, which I didn't do, so I never pursued that. So there are other secrets buried there that we will probably never know. The next story that I broke through a FOIL, not as easily though. The DOE in New York City had a teacher evaluation system that they were piloting that was called Teacher Data Reports, that was based solely on value-added test scores. And when they first revealed this system, they said that a panel of independent experts had validated the methodology and approved of it as reliable. Shortly thereafter, I FOILed for the names of the members of this supposed independent panel and any reports that they had produced showing the validity of the model. I waited then more than a year, which is not unusual for the DOE. I waited 15 months until I finally got a response. When I got the response, it said actually that the DOE no longer claimed that this technical experts had validated the methodology, and that the approval had rested solely with the DOE. And they also sent a report written by a panel of academic experts, which said explicitly that they were not endorsing this method or use of the rating system. The test scores are only one aspect of a teacher's effectiveness, that if high stakes were attached, as DOE planned to do, there would be the potential of corruption and gaming the system. And there are many other things that influence test scores other than merely teacher quality, as we know. Next slide. I actually didn't reveal this information right away because I was waiting for a news hook, and one actually came by in October 2010 when DOE said they were going to release the names and the ratings of teachers in New York City based upon this system. And this contradicted a written promise that Chris Cerf had made a couple years before, saying that they would not release this information and that they would resist any FOIL. But Joel Klein went back on it, asked reporters to FOIL it, and then refused to resist when they did. And the UFT, the teachers union, went to court to try to stop it. They ultimately failed, and the ratings were released. But at the same time, I decided this was a propitious time to release this report. So I gave it to the guy who's probably the best investigative reporter in New York City, named Juan Gonzalez, who wrote about it in his column that said that the expert panel had not attested to its validity, quite the opposite, and that one of the people who was on the panel, who also helped devise the methodology, said that in fact he didn't think that it would necessarily be a good idea to make it public because it wasn't reliable enough. And Juan also pointed out that while DOE was rushing to make this public because of reporter FOILs, it had taken me 15 months to get my FOIL responded to. Next slide. And here's a headline from Juan Gonzalez's column about this. Next slide. So then there's the Parthenon report, which I actually didn't get through FOILing, as someone outside the DOE emailed it to me and a lot of other people. I don't know whether they saw the significance or not. It was a 2008 report that was produced by the Parthenon consultants, who are consultants to the Gates Foundation. I got a draft copy that said confidential. I read it in 2009. And what it said was interesting was that DOE basically determined which high schools would succeed and fail by how many overage 8th graders were sent to it. And DOE controls the high school admissions process, so they were pretty much determining which high schools would succeed or fail based upon how many overage high school kids they sent there. I actually did offer to a reporter who didn't see the significance of it at the time in January 2010, and then I didn't pursue it anymore. I held on to it. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah, so then in 2011, the DOE was closing en masse many struggling high schools and creating quite a storm about that. And I thought this was a time to try to pitch it to another reporter, because there were lots of people who said that this was unfair and that they were doing the best they can given the high concentration of struggling students that had been sent there by DOE, especially since the small schools had excluded these students. And so I sent it to a reporter at Gotham Schools. She saw the significance of it. I also pointed her to the particular slide that said, you know, how DOE was basically determining, and Parthenon had asked them at the time, should we make sure that no high school fails by limiting the number of overage students? And they obviously never did that. And in the future, this report was widely cited as exposing the DOE's complicity in the failure of so many high schools. And here are some headlines that were generated from that particular report. Next slide. This is just a wonderful former charter parent who I met through a friend whose kid had been kicked out of charter school, Success Charters, in kindergarten. I heard her story. I then pitched it to Michael Weinrip, who was a great columnist for the New York Times in education at that point, and he did a fantastic story on her experience. And now a lot of stories have come out about Success Charter kicking out kids, but this was the first one back in 2011. Then this was the most fun story that I ever was a part of. In April 2012, New York State was given the second year of the Common Core exams written by Pearson. The exams were terrible. They were full of confusing questions. The teachers said they didn't know what the answers to were, very arcane reading passages, and they were full of commercial product placements with logos, etc. So the year before, I had started blogging about this and saying, anyone who has comments about this, please leave their comments below. Next slide. Next slide. So that was the blog that I did, Flawed, Confusing, and Misleading ELA Exams. I did that right after the ELA exams had been given. Next slide. So someone did leave a comment, and you can see the comment there at the top. Apparently, 8th graders thought the story about the hare and the pineapple was so ridiculous, they've started a Facebook page about it. 8th graders from across New York State are weighing in with comments. And so I immediately Googled the Facebook page. I also found that there was another website devoted to this question. And by doing about 20 minutes worth of research, I found that this passage about a talking pineapple and a race with the hare had been given in at least 6 states since 2006 and had confused and upset teachers and students ever since. And yet the same passage was being given over and over and over again. And luckily, I had an 8th grader at that point who had just taken the test. When he came home, I asked him if he had it, and he said he confirmed it, and he said he'd been arguing with his best friend about what the right answers were. The next morning, I blogged about the pineapple. I was on the train to D.C. to a meeting at the Ed Department, and I blogged that I'd found the passage and how outrageous it was that Pearson had been giving this over and over and over. And I also posted the link on my listserv that several different reporters subscribed to. Next slide. Next slide. I got a call from the Daily News reporter that day. She asked me a couple questions. That evening, she posted a story in the Daily News about talking pineapple on state exam stumps everyone. Next slide. And then the most amazing firestorm happened. Lots of reporters followed up on TV and in print. I think because one of the reasons it exploded the story is that anyone who read the story could understand how absurd it was and how ridiculous to give it an exam to 8th graders, unlike some other stories in education where it's kind of hard to grasp the entire framework unless you've done a little bit of work on it. Our commissioner, John King, held a press conference the next day. He said he released the full passage. He said he would exclude the scoring on the exam, though he did also say that he tried to blame New York teachers by saying they had vetted it. The controversy went on for weeks, and here's a part of the passage that was then released. Go on. Here are some of the headlines. New York Times, elsewhere. But if you Google it, you will see literally hundreds and hundreds of stories that were generated by this pineapple issue. For whatever reason, it went international. And here are just some of the images. It really became a symbol for the incompetence and absurdity of standardized testing. And it's a story that still has legs. In last May, John Oliver did like a 20-minute takedown on standardized testing, where he used this as an example, and you can see on the screenshot, that's my blog right there about the pineapple. Next slide. Next slide. And then I was just reading a report from Center for American Progress, which is a big supporter of Common Core and testing, this January. Next slide. And they had actually surveyed parents in several different states about their attitudes towards testing, and they found that many of the parents said that their attitudes had been helped to be formed by that John Oliver segment on standardized testing. So this is something that is still has legs and is still affected a lot of people's opinions, and was really amazingly easy and fun to expose that story. In Bloom was another very big story, which quite the opposite, took a very, very long time to gain national prominence. I spent years on this before anyone would report on it from the national press. I first read about it in August 2011 in a blog post on the Gates Foundation website, where she talked about this app that 9 states would share and that would help teachers teach and students learn. She said it was state-led, a state-led suite of online tools. Next slide. I was disturbed about this because not only with the Gates Foundation involvement, but they were also going to hire Murdoch's wireless generation, which was just now led by our former Chancellor, Joel Klein, to build the operating system. And I really didn't know what it was about, but I thought it sounded very fishy, and I blogged about it 6 days later on Huffington Post. Next slide. 5 months later, I read in the Wall Street Journal that our State Board of Education had signed on to this effort of the Gates Foundation called the Shared Learning Collaborative, that they were going to share the personal student data of the students in our state with this project of the Gates Foundation. They were awarding the Gates Foundation were funding it by $76.5 million, with $44 million going to wireless. The Gates Foundation would eventually spend more than $100 million on this project. Then I spent more than a year blogging about it, going to elected officials. No one knew about it. No one really believed me about it. Diane Ravitch blogged about it as well. I held town hall meetings, press conferences, talked to school board members. Again, no one had been told about it. I started reaching out to parents in the 8 other in Bloom states. None of them had heard anything about it. I emailed and called all the national education reporters I knew, including several on the New York Times, and none of them were interested whatsoever in the story. They didn't understand the importance. Finally, in February, the Gates Foundation spun off the Shared Learning Collaborative as a separate corporation called In Bloom, Inc. After months of trying, I finally found one reporter, national reporter, who would write about this, Stephanie Simon, who was then at Reuters, and she wrote a fantastic story, and she actually published it the day of the South by Southwest Education Conference in Austin, which is this big shindig for ed tech mavens, and Bill Gates and In Bloom were co-sponsoring it, and it created a big buzz. Later, it was followed up by the other reporters, and finally, 8 months later, one of their tech reporters in the New York Times finally wrote about it. Next slide. Next slide. And then this is the story that Stephanie wrote, which was really great. Next slide. Boom. Immediately after the Simon article appeared, parents started protesting in all the 9 states, contacting their state officials, contacting their superintendents. The state officials, elected officials got upset, started pressuring education officials. And in a matter of 8 months, one by one, every single in Bloom state pulled out except for New York because of parent protests. We were the last state to pull out, possibly because we had John King, our commissioner, who was the worst guy in the world on student privacy. Now, of course, he's the education secretary of the U.S. Department of Education. Finally, we had to pressure the legislature to pass a bill against it, which finally happened on March 31st, 2014, and in April, in Bloom closed its doors. Next slide. And this is the final one I'm going to talk about. It's my most recent baby. I was looking over contracts in February 2014. Actually, I think it was 2015. Yeah. Was it 2014? No, I can't remember. 2015, I was looking over proposed contracts by the Board of Education. And it was, I saw this incredible contract that was $1.1 billion. It was going to a contractor for internet wiring. I Googled the name. I found my own testimony from 2 years before the city council about a corrupt kickback scheme that this guy Ross Lanham had gone to jail for, and that this very company had been involved in stealing millions from DOE. Next slide. I blogged about this immediately. So it was 2015, February 2015. It was actually a $2 billion contract over 9 years, $1.1 billion over 5 years. I couldn't believe it. It blew my head off the way InBloom did when I first read about that. I contacted reporters immediately because the vote was going to happen that week. Next, and here are some of the headlines in the New York Post and the Daily News. Next headline. And here's one from Chalkbeat. Next headline. What was amazing was that in one day, the DOE renegotiated the contract from $1.1 billion to $637 million, essentially cutting the cost in half. And despite all the bad press and everything that had been written about it, our mayorally appointed school board still approved the contract 10-1. Next slide. Next month, to my amazement and real contentment, the City Hall rejected the contract, pushed it back. The first time this had ever happened, and the DOE canceled the contract. Next slide. They rebid the contract for $472 million for several different companies. This saved $163 million over the renegotiated price, $627 million than the initial price, and actually the savings I think was more than that, $100 million more, because we've been cut off from the federal E-rate program for several years, believe it or not, because of this very same scandal that this company was involved in. So I thought we would probably forever be cut off from the E-rate program, where we were supposed to get $100 million if this contract had gone through. And the DOE has announced some reforms to the contracting process as a result. And here's a headline about that. And in the end, the last paragraph, Juan Gonzalez gave a nice plug to me about how they should have given me a finder's fee, or at least use some of the money for class size reduction, which of course they're not going to do. So here are the lessons learned from my experience. Use FOIL, peruse budget documents, read comments to blogs, analyze, dissect, and figure out in advance what might be newsworthy and important. When you obtain interesting information, pitch the story to a reporter who is usually looking for good stories. If you can, wait and sit on it until you get a really good news hook. And if no reporter bites, as that happened with InBloom, blog about it yourself, try to make some noise, and be persistent, because you never know, you may win out in the end. Okay, so that's my presentation. Thanks.
Thank you, Leonie. Oh my God, there was so much information in the course of just a few minutes. Before I turn it over to Dora, and then we'll do questions afterwards, what I interpreted from that is what any of us who have been involved in this effort know, which is in and day out, we are working to try to reveal the truth. And what Leonie has shown is that while it may take weeks or months or years, that if you go about it in a very thoughtful fashion, we can have a profound impact. And that is, when something looks like it's wrong, it probably is wrong. And because the media has so few reporters these days, and because the mass media has changed so dramatically over the last, there simply isn't the time. They don't have the expertise, they don't have the time to do the kind of investigative reporting that theoretically they once did. And so what it provides bloggers and other public education advocates with is the opportunity to be a conduit to looking at information, collecting information, using freedom of information requests in order to get documents that are clearly there, but that nobody else is asking for. And then when you put the pieces together, you then have the opportunity either to turn it over to a quote-unquote mass media, mainstream media reporter, which is often the best course of action if you can find one, because they will then use their platform to bring it into the open, or to use your own platform to get it out there in the public domain. And many of us are finding that while we started out simply talking about looking for an opportunity to talk about these issues, we're actually a vehicle for bringing in information that has never been brought forward because simply doesn't have the time or the expertise or the interest or whatever it may be. So those three examples that Leonie gave, each of those is a lesson to us that we can have a profound impact. Now, Leonie is an expert, and she has done more than perhaps any other person in the country to bring those issues forward. But at the national or state or even local level, many of us can have the same kind of impact. So hold your questions for a moment. We will then shift to Dora, who has also used freedom of information requests to identify major issues. And then at the end, we can open it up and have some questions and discussions about that. But as you think about what Leonie just presented, I know in my case, I'm thinking about examples where I saw something and I said, that just doesn't make sense. And I often use freedom of information requests for two different reasons. One is to collect the information, and then secondly is just to make sure that the enemies of public education know that we're out here and we're watching them. But it really is amazing what happens when you get a hold of a contract, like the kinds of contracts that Leonie got, and the impact that you can have directly or indirectly in disrupting or even derailing those kinds of contracts. So next, let me turn it over to Dora for her portion of the presentation.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My focus has been more local in terms of what's been happening basically in the Northwest. And although the effect of the research and subsequent posts have gained national attention, for me it started a community meeting on school closures several years ago. Two words stayed with me from that meeting: Broad and charter schools. And at that meeting I met Sue Peters, who's now one of my co-editors and also is a school board director, as well as Jesse Hagopian and other teachers and parents who figured prominently in my life and in advocacy for public schools. After our work, which we did together on a march and rally against the school closures, we kept our listserv going and began to research exactly who Eli Broad was and just what charter schools were. We had discovered that our superintendent had graduated from the Broad Academy, and Eli Broad's focus was on charter schools. The superintendent's actions didn't make any sense in terms of demographics and the knowledge that our city was growing. And as it was alluded to, it just didn't smell right. Something just wasn't right. Within the parents group, we had a professional journalist, an attorney who kept telling us to follow the money, a statistician, a writer, and an analyst who specializes in reviewing studies and papers. We began to research via Google, looking at newspaper articles, particularly old ones. We looked at newspaper articles that were written in Charleston, where our road superintendent had previously worked. We also found out who she worked with there in Charleston, who she brought with her, because that was very enlightening as well. The Broad Foundation had lots of information on their website, and we researched what organizations and individuals they were donating to, such as Teach for America. We also discovered the Gates Foundation awarded grants website at that time and found we could get other nonprofit organizations' incomes and expenses by finding or requesting their 990s. We looked at organizations' board of directors, who they were and their affiliations, and sometimes the website would even show a list of their big donors. Along the way, we discovered people like Joe Bracey and Leonie, and we found the Broad Report and other websites, and it helped us put the pieces together. It also helped us know that we weren't crazy, that there was stuff happening beyond our district, much of it similar to what was happening in Seattle, and none of it was good for our communities or our students. We were gathering so much information that was very awkward and difficult to access, so I decided to put it online. My choice was either a website or a blog format, and I chose a blog because it was easier to learn how to create a blog. Originally, it was just to be used by a small group of parents to find articles and links they needed, but then I decided to start writing articles about the information we were gathering. My first post was, "What is a charter school?" Eventually, we got all together over a few lunches at my house and decided to create a chart showing the connections we had made. If you Google lines of influence Seattle education, you'll find a link to the PDF of the chart. Eventually, by informing the public of the players involved in the school closures and their agendas, it laid the groundwork for the superintendent's firing by the Seattle School Board. And also that lines of influence chart went national, much to my surprise. Actually, people were coming up to me when I was in New York asking me about it at one point. After that, I looked at the history of public schools in Seattle and pinpointed how the Broad virus first infected our district. And you can Google the Battle for Seattle Education and in it find links to that series of posts. So to sum up my first foray into this sort of research, I looked at 990s, organizations' websites, who their board members were, newsletters of organizations, videos on YouTube, and you'd be surprised what you can find on YouTube. I used the Gates Foundation search engine extensively, looked through local newspapers for articles on people, and looked at the PDC for donors of various elected officials, which is also very enlightening. I think to do this sort of work, you have to be very curious with a strong desire to get your questions answered. It also helps tremendously to work with others. There are many ways to unearth the information, and the more people you have working with you who you trust, the more ways there are to get to the information. It takes a lot of creativity as well. By the time I completed those two posts, I had developed a good list of sources who would contact me with information. This information I would either file away for future use or act on immediately, depending upon what the time frame was. Then I discovered FOIAs. In Washington State, it's the Public Records Act, although we call it a FOIA. That took us to another level. The FOIAs are time-consuming, and it can be a very, very frustrating process, but they can also be very fruitful. My first foray into FOIAs was completely by accident. I was trying to find out who within the city of Seattle had approved levy money to be given to a charter school. It had been a closely guarded secret, but one of my sources told me it had happened, so I contacted the appropriate people within the city to gain more information. They immediately sent me to the city attorney, who then treated my inquiries as a FOIA and said the response would take 20 to 30 days. Typically, that's what they say, although it usually takes longer. After about a month, what I received from the city was a heavily redacted and useless piece of information. It wasn't even information. It only showed me there was much they were hiding. I did this FOIA action 2 more times and received more redacted emails. So I wrote a piece on that experience and posted it for others to come to their own conclusions. The next time was far more fruitful because we knew what we were doing a little bit better. A parent who I worked with before on other posts and who provided me with very good information in the past decided to find out how charter schools, which have been deemed unconstitutional by our state Supreme Court, were being funded to keep their doors open. A word had it that there was a small school district out in the far reaches of our state, the Mary Walker School District, that was taking money from the state and funneling it to the charter schools. By this time, all of us had gotten a little more sophisticated on how to search for information. With FOIA, it's best to know as much as possible before submitting a request. Basically, find out who is involved and who might be at the center of most of the communication. My source decided to start with the superintendent of the school district and those who might be communicating with that person, including OSPI, which is our office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction for Washington State, the Gates Foundation, and the Charter School Commission within a specified time frame. And the more focused and specific you can get, the better the information, the faster you can receive it. With that request came a treasure trove of information that I was able to use in 2 posts. The first one, emails reveal the Gates machine in action, and emails reveal OSPI in contempt of Supreme Court ruling on charter schools in Washington State. I will say in conclusion that there are many tools available to us now with so much wonderful access to the internet. It's a matter of finding different ways to get the information. It also helps to have friends because you can work with each other. I can work with people who are trusted sources, and we can brainstorm on how to find what we need. Also, in terms of FOIAs, there's a great website, Electronic Frontier Foundation, gives you excellent information. Also, in terms of bloggers, if you're a representative of a news media outlet, you're entitled not to be charged fees for agencies when you do your record search, and you may qualify. The FOIA makes it clear that alternative media and freelance journalists can qualify as representatives of the news media for fee purposes. So if you plan to publish the information on your blog based on the records you're seeking, you should note this in your request and ask for a fee waiver or reduction. And the information can come in any form: maps, photographs, computer disk, and email. So go for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dora. Thank you, Leonie. We will now turn it over to any questions that the participants have. Let me just say, as a precursor of that I try to file a Freedom of Information request at least once a week. I do that for 2 different reasons. One is, obviously, I want to collect as much information, and my blog's focus is primarily here in Connecticut on the East Coast, and I'm tracking the very same kinds of issues that Leonie and Dora are talking about. And I'm constantly amazed about what these Freedom of Information requests produce, because when you ask for any, and under Connecticut's Freedom of Information request, and most states are pretty much the same, and we will get out to all of the participants some links for guidance on how to do these. But basically what you say is, I'd like any emails, documents, correspondence related issue X between the dates of A and B, that what you get are a variety of emails and documents and correspondence. In our state, in my state, Connecticut, if the document is electronic, it must be handed over for free, and so it's a way to collect large amounts of information. And some of it is clearly not productive, but much of it is in fact very useful to understand how things are going on, as I said, behind closed doors. But also many times it provides a map or a road, a document that gives you a roadmap of how decisions are being made and the kinds of relationships that are taking place. And so I do it for two reasons. One, in order to collect the information, and secondly, just to make sure that they are constantly aware that people are watching. Most of mine lately have been related to the opt-out movement and the efforts in this state, in the state of Connecticut, to try to clamp down on parental rights and to punish students and parents. But I would recommend that anybody who's on this call consider using Freedom of Information requests in order to, one, get a sense of how to do it. It takes time. The first one is not as good as the second. It's not as good as the third. And so you learn how to craft the Freedom of Information request in such a way as to get the information that you're looking for, but also that in this era in which so many public officials are no longer consider themselves public servants, it's an effective way to make sure that not only are you collecting information, whether it's in your blog or to pass on to reporters or pass on to others, but also just simply to make sure that the corporate education reform industry knows that they are not going to go unchallenged. So we have two people who clearly have case studies on how Freedom of Information requests can make a fundamental, extraordinary difference at the district, state, and national level, and we'd love to have any questions that you have about either how to create those, or how to create Freedom of Information requests, or how to, or suggestions that you have from your own experiences about ways in which people can go about being an effective Freedom of Information request activist. Anthony, do you want to jump in about how best to ask questions here?
Sure. Yeah, people have been typing questions in the under questions, which is great. And so let's see if we can go down the list and start with Carl Peterson. Carl, let's see if we can get you on the mic. If you've got a mic on your computer, I'm going to try and, yeah, you're live. So go ahead, Carl, and ask your question.
Sure. I've been doing requests. In California, there are Public Records Act requests, and I'm finding a lot of stonewalling. Is there any resources for getting around that?
So any of our panelists want to take that on?
Well, you know, anytime that they don't respond, you can appeal, and every state has a different way to appeal. In our state, it was to appeal to John King, the commissioner, which wasn't, you know, when I was foiling information about In Bloom from the state education department. So that wasn't particularly effective. And then you have to go to court if you don't get a reasonable response from the commissioner. And we were actually about to go to court when we finally got a trove of In Bloom emails a year and a half after we had foiled them. And not coincidentally, the day after John King announced that he was going to leave the Department of Education to become the top aide to Arne Duncan. So I really don't know how you get something if they don't want to give it to you, except to go to court. And of course that costs money, and you know, you can try to get a pro bono attorney, but even the court costs can be expensive. But if it's an issue of great public concern, sometimes you can find a pro bono attorney to represent you in court.
All right.
I'd also like to add that someone else was on the trail too, in terms of trying to figure out where this money was coming from to the charter schools. They started with OSPI, the office, the state superintendent, and got nowhere, and it took a long time for that person to ever get any kind of response. Whereas we went to the school district superintendent, And maybe they didn't know any better, I don't know, but they got it to us fairly quickly, relatively speaking, and we got more than we ever thought we would get. So I also think it depends upon who you direct your inquiry to.
And Carl, this is Jonathan Pelto. One of the things that I often do is I will do a blog or a letter that I will send to the members of the Education Committee or the Legislature's Education Committee or some other group in which I CC the entity that I'm asking the information and saying, why won't the entity provide the information to a Connecticut, in this case, a Connecticut citizen? And I find that including a third party often gets the entity to be to pay more attention to my requests. Sometimes I do it to the legislature, sometimes I do it to the governor's office, sometimes I do it to a reporter, but the idea that you want to include somebody that the entity will be concerned about them sort of saying what the heck is going on. I've even in Connecticut I've even sent it to other, if I put in an FOI request to a superintendent of schools, I go ahead and send a letter when I don't get a response to 10 or 12 other superintendents saying, I haven't been able to get this information. Do you have this information for your district? And when they see that their colleagues know about their effort to drag their heels, in a number of cases, the information has. That's not to say that it works every time, and I recognize that there are a lot of people that try to get around the Freedom of Information laws, but that go ahead and include third parties, you often find a recognition that it's better to turn over something than to have the embarrassment of turned over nothing. Now, many times, of course, you're only getting a portion of what you want, and so then you have to go back and do it all over again.
All right, thank you, Jonathan and Dora and Leonie. Our next question comes from Adam Keller. Adam, I'm going to try and unmute you. Let's see if that'll work. So let's give it a shot.
Sure. Thanks for taking my question. I'm in Alabama, and as far as I'm aware, our Open Records Act has no timeline at all. So I noticed y'all mentioned a 20-day timeline, but is that just for federal requests, or does it really vary state by state?
It varies state by state, and they'll say like it's going to take so much time to do, but it's been my experience that it takes longer than what they say it's going to take.
Well, the timeline, my understanding is that they just need to send you an email in that time period to say that they got your request and they're looking for the files or they're looking for the records. And then I get new emails every 6 weeks, and sometimes they can go on for 2 years.
One of the things that I often do with my blog is sort of the day 21, waiting to hear from the State Department of Education, day 34, and then of course I send that link to the commissioner and to the chief of staff of the Department of Education and to the legislative liaison and to the chair, the Senate chair of the Education Committee and the House chair of the Education Committee. So there's no question that these people oftentimes want to avoid providing information, but it's like, I guess you'd say it's like a game of chess, which is, fine if that's the tactic that you're going to take. The other thing that I found somewhat useful is I often send my request when it hasn't been responded to a reporter saying, I can't get these people to respond to this Freedom of Information request. Is there any chance that you could follow up? And a number of reporters, particularly those that are more committed to ensuring that the truth be told, will go ahead and say, that's an interesting question. Let me put in a request as well. And the mainstream media gets a response much more quickly than we bloggers do. On the other hand, the mainstream media would never have put in that request if we had not alerted them to the potential issue.
Right. We're almost to the 1 hour mark, so I wanna do a couple of quick announcements, and then if folks want to stick around, we can take some more questions. Um, but I do want to share a few announcements. For those of you that weren't here at the start, you are attending a webinar sponsored by the Network for Public Education Action, which is closely affiliated with the Network for Public Education. We're having a very exciting event in less than a month in Raleigh, North Carolina. There's going to be a lot of Leonie will be there, Dora will be there. They're both on panels there. Jonathan will be there as an education blogger. You can see some of the keynotes that we'll have. Jesse Hagopian, who was mentioned earlier, Diane Ravitch, Bob Herbert, William Barber, Dr. Phil Lanou, who's the Superintendent of the Year, and Karen Harper Royal from New Orleans. So it's going to be a really fantastic event. The registration is still open and there's still room. So I hope you'll consider joining us. These events are really exciting and motivational. This is the contact information for the Education Bloggers Network. I'll paste that in the chat box as well. If you have if you are a blogger and you want to connect with the Education Bloggers Network, please write to Jonathan at the email in the chat box. There's the website, there's the Facebook page, and there's the Twitter feed, so that you can stay connected. It's a great network to be a part of. And I also wanted to mention that there is another webinar of a similar nature to this one that's coming up in a few weeks, in a couple of weeks. And lastly, please, if you are have the resources to do so, please support our work. We really need donations to support NPE Action. Obviously, we're not getting any corporate funding, and this all of us, everybody on the phone in this webinar is donating our time, as I'm sure you are. But we do have bills to pay to keep the lights on for the organization. So if you can make a donation, that would be greatly appreciated. Now we're at the 1 hour mark, and we still have a full room, so we can go back and work on some more of the questions that were asked. Leslie Guerra, do you want to ask your question from Maryland? And I will see if I can unmute you. Let's see. Or if you can unmute yourself, Leslie. Leslie has a question about conflict of interest related to Pearson and Montgomery schools.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. Actually, I got some ideas already listening from the other questions. But one thing that happened in my school district, Montgomery County Public Schools, our school system went into partnership with Pearson Educational and actually is writing Common Core curriculum that then is being sold to other states. And part of this partnership is Pearson reserves the right to come into the schools and bring other people with them, other interested partnerships, to see how our students are doing. Now, as a parent, I never signed up for that, and I don't agree to it, but no one asked us, if our children should be, allowed to be looked at as guinea pigs, and I don't know how to put a stop to it. I try to talk to other parents, but they seem to be too busy or not in Montgomery County Public Schools would this happen. And I seem to be at a loss on how to make people understand there are so many different things going on and how to get them to pay attention what's happening to our kids.
Thank you, Leslie. Anybody want to offer Leslie a little bit of advice?
Well, is the curriculum bad? I mean, is the programming bad? Because if that's the case, then I think it's easier to activate parents because they'll, make them aware of it, or they'll be aware of it from the reactions of their kids. I mean, that's what's happened in New York with the Pearson tests and the Common Core Engaged New York curriculum. People realized how poor quality was, and that's why we had massive pushback and opt-out movement in New York State. If there's nothing you can specifically point to in terms of a low quality of the programming, or specifically in terms of loss of privacy, I think it is going to be hard to activate parents.
I guess I have like three concerns. One of them is, the fact that they are allowed to bring kids in. But, one of the things that my biggest thing is with data privacy. And I don't know who owns the data. And as far as the school systems having to report data to the federal level or the local level and so on, I understand that. But our school system will also loan out data for other people to look at and analyze, has sold data. And as a parent, I think that I should have the right to say, no, you can't use my child's data, or I feel that they have to ask us to use the data, and I'm not really sure what the answer is to that on who does own the data.
So look, we have a national coalition called the Parent Coalition for Student Privacy, and we were just in D.C. Our co-chair testified before the House Education Committee this week. And I can tell you, if they're actually selling data, that's a huge, huge story that any reporter is going to be interested in. As a parent, you have the right to know exactly who they're sharing the data with, which data they're sharing, and under what circumstances. You have the right to see the contract as well. And if there's no contract, that's a problem in and of itself. If you want to contact me offline, I can give you more advice about this. But you still have specific rights under federal law. And I believe Maryland also has a state law on student privacy that you can exercise to try to find out more information.
Yes, that would be great, because I actually found online some information, and one of the data, actual live data on there, was my son's test scores from the MSA. So there was already a data breach, and I happened to come upon it because it was my child's data was part of that.
Well, I imagine a reporter would be very interested in that story, but why don't you contact me offline and we can discuss in more detail.
All right, thank you very much.
And Leslie, I mean, one of the things that I find the Freedom of Information request useful for is that if you do a specific request, let's say you say, I want any emails related to Pearson between January 1st and March 1st, oftentimes they will respond to those kinds of things, and within that you then pick up, I mean, one could call it a fishing expedition, but you pick up something that you can then use to expand your second request or to turn it over to a reporter. So in your case, certainly one of the things would be to ask for the contract, to ask for any memos that have been sent to to the Board of Education, to faculty, to teachers, to others related to the Pearson contract. And what I find that reporters want, and for the most part, I think that mainstream reporters are very well-meaning, but the situation has changed dramatically over the last 20 years. I was a state legislator in the early 80s to the early 90s in Connecticut, and the Hartford Courant, which is the main paper in Connecticut, had 9 reporters covering the legislature when I was a legislator. Today they have 1 reporter and 2 part-time reporters. What has happened is that it's not that these reporters don't care, but they have such a tremendous burden in order to create a story a day or 2 stories a day. So what you need to do is to be able to give them the material that they wouldn't be able to get on on their own. And so oftentimes I'll take a couple of emails that I've collected via a Freedom of Information request and call a reporter. I mean, it changes over time as you get to know these people, and say, here's an interesting story, and here's a couple of documents that I think would be helpful. And I have found that, I don't know, 80 or 90% of reporters will say, that is an interesting story, and thank you for providing me with the material, and now I'll follow it up. They wouldn't follow it up on their own if it wasn't that you provided them with some material. So one of the reasons to use Freedom of Information requests is simply to get hold of documents that one would hope that the reporters themselves would be accessing, but in fact they can't, either because they don't have the time, or in fact they don't see themselves as muckrakers. And from what you're describing, that contract with Pearson would be, you ask for the contract, you ask for any communication related to the contract, you keep it limited to a specific time period so that they can't say, oh, that will take too much time to collect, and then you go ahead and try to find a reporter who would be interested in actually doing a story about it. And I think that, and I think and hope that you'll find that there will be people who will say, now that's something that you give them enough background that they can then go ahead and do the story. And as much as we bloggers feel that we have strong followings of thousands of people who read our blogs every day, in fact, it's when you can get it into the mainstream, you get a very different response. And then just to close, I always feel like the shortcut is to go ahead and give it to legislators themselves. Oftentimes, legislators don't respond to what I send them, but I know that many of them have, or some of them have read it, and I can see in the way in which they then respond to reporters' questions that every legislator wants to look like they know what they're talking about, and oftentimes when you send them information, they may not respond, they may not go ahead and acknowledge that you have given them a valuable piece of information, but when you watch them react going forward, you can see that they actually have utilized some of the information that you have sent them.
All right. I think we're getting, it's almost quarter after, so I want to have one more question, which is actually a very specific one from Rachel, who's looking for somebody in her area who might be interested in working with her on a project. Rachel, do you want to make a little pitch to the group and explain what you're looking for?
Well, at the moment, it's a little bit vague, but I'm looking for somebody in Oregon who's willing to look into how the decisions are made between the Oregon Department of Education versus the Oregon Board, and that is very ambiguous. We also had a previous organization that's since been closed, but another one has popped up, and that seems to be circumventing the democratic process.
Yeah, okay.
So the OIEB.
Thank you, Rachel. So, Rachel, if you want, you could type in your email address into the chat box and send it to everyone. And then if folks are interested in working on something around Oregon, then they can get in touch with you. I know Dora may be spending a little bit of time in that area. Maybe she will help. I want to give Bob George a quick chance to give a little pitch on the Save Our Schools March, because Save Our Schools has very kindly given us access to this platform. And Bob, you want to give a little pitch for the SOS March? Are you still there?
Yes, thank you.
Right.
Yeah, I'm still here. Yeah, I just had to unmute myself. In 2011, there was the first, and at that time the only, SOS March. And we had about 8,000 people get together in D.C. Well, it's 5 years it's an election year, and we are planning to do a reprise that's broader and more connected with both social and racial justice as well as education justice. And it's going to be on July the 8th in D.C. At the Lincoln Memorial. And you can get more information by going to saveourschools.org, or the Bats have it on their place, and UO has it on their place, and MP has information, because we are in a coalition of some 11 groups at this point that are working together to bring people together. And speakers will be on the 8th, and there'll also be a conference on the 9th. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Bob. Well,
Anthony,
yes, Donna.
this is Jonathan. If I can just also put in a last pitch for the Education Network. Many of the people who participated and listened in tonight are actually not members of the Bloggers Network. If you blog, or if you write commentary pieces, or if you write letters to the editor, we'd love to have you as part of the network. Or if you'd just like to connect with us and listen in to some of our future webinars. The next one is going to be related to how to reach additional audiences. Please go ahead and drop me a note at John Pelto, JONPELTO, at gmail.com. We are going to have another one on Thursday, April 5th, on how to reach out to and how to expand your reach and how to have more of an impact. And these are the first two. And we really appreciate you being part of the guinea pigs for our first one on how do we go ahead and create webinars that are useful to people. So we thank you, and we apologize also for our learning as we go along. But we're going to have a number of these on a variety of different topics. And if you'd like to listen in and participate, just drop me a note, and I will make sure that you get an invite to each of the upcoming webinars, the next one being on Thursday, April 5th. That's on the screen now. All you have to do is copy the link and then go ahead and join that one. And most importantly, I want to thank you. You know, we're all in this together. We are fighting a corporate education reform industry that has unlimited resources. And on our side, we don't have the millions of dollars, but we have something far more profound. And that is we have students and parents and teachers who really believe in the fundamental purpose of public education. And we're not going to allow these people to destroy what is so important to our children and our future. And we will continue to fight back and push back. And when we started, Diane and I and Anthony and Leonie and Dora and many others, now nearly 4 or 5 years ago, there was no hope for changing the dynamic. And now 4 or 5 years later, we're starting to see that change in state after state after state. So this is truly an uprising. It is a revolution. It is a rebellion. And if you'd like to be part of it, we'd ask you to go ahead and do exactly that. So Anthony, thank you for putting all of this together, and we hope that we'll see many of you on Thursday, April 5th.
Thank you, and look for an email from us. This session was recorded, so if you want to share it with anybody, we will be sending out an email with links to a lot of the resources that were shared tonight, and also a link to the recording if you want to share it with anybody. Thanks everybody for coming, and we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks on April 5th, same time. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you, Dora and Leonie, very much.